All right, let me tell you about something that happened to me a few years ago when I was still driving trucks full time. It's one of those stories that I don't share often, mainly because it still freaks me out whenever I think about it. It wasn't some supernatural event or anything like that, but it was terrifying in a way that's hard to explain. It made me realize just how vulnerable you can be out there on the road and how quickly things can go from normal to seriously messed up. So, this happened during a long haul trip from Chicago to Denver. It was a pretty routine gig. Pick up a load of electronics in Chicago, drive through the night, and deliver them to a warehouse in Denver the next day. I'd done this route a few times before, so I knew what to expect. A lot of empty highways, truck stops, and not much else. It was late November, and the weather was starting to get cold, but nothing too extreme yet. Just the kind of crisp, chilly nights where the air is fresh and the roads are mostly clear. I set off from Chicago around 6 p.m., planning to drive straight through the night. The first few hours were uneventful, just me and the road, with the occasional car or truck passing by. I had my playlist going, and I was feeling pretty good. Focused, but relaxed. After a while, the traffic thinned out even more, and I found myself on a long stretch of highway with nothing but darkness ahead of me. Around midnight, I started feeling a bit tired, so I decided to pull over at the next truck stop to grab a coffee and stretch my legs. I wasn't in a rush, and it's always a good idea to take a break when you start feeling the road hypnotizing you. I saw a sign for a truck stop about 10 miles ahead, so I figured I'd stop there. When I pulled into the truck stop, it was pretty much deserted. There were a few other rigs parked there, but I didn't see anyone around. The lights inside the building were on, but it didn't look like there was much activity. Still, I parked, got out of the truck, and headed inside. The place was typical. Fluorescent lights, a small convenience store, and a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. The guy behind the counter barely looked up when I walked in, and there was an older couple sitting in one of the booths, quietly eating their food. I grabbed a coffee from the machine, paid for it, and walked back outside to get some fresh air. As I was standing there, sipping my coffee and looking out at the dark highway, I noticed something that made me pause. Parked a few spaces away from my truck was another rig, but something about it seemed off. The cab was dark, no lights on inside, and the windows were so tinted that I couldn't see in at all. The trailer looked old and a bit beat up, like it hadn't been maintained in a while. I didn't think much of it at first. Just another trucker taking a break, maybe sleeping in his cab. But as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I finished my coffee and tossed the cup in the trash, then decided to check on my load, just to make sure everything was secure. It was something I did regularly, just out of habit. As I walked around the back of my trailer, I noticed that the other truck's door was slightly open, just a crack, like someone had left it ajar. I stopped and stared at it for a second, wondering if I should check it out, but then I decided against it. It wasn't any of my business, and I didn't want to get involved in something that could turn out to be nothing. I headed back to my cab, did a quick walk around to make sure everything was in order, and then climbed back in. I was about to start the engine when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned and saw a figure walking toward my truck, coming from the direction of the other rig. My first thought was that it was the driver of the other truck, maybe coming over to chat or ask for help with something. But as the figure got closer, I realized it wasn't another trucker. It was a woman, and she looked like she was in her late 20s or early 30s. She was wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up over her head, and she had her hands stuffed in the front pocket. Her face was pale, and she looked nervous, like she was trying to figure out what to do next. I rolled down the window as she approached, thinking she might need help or a ride, but the closer she got, the more uneasy I felt. She stopped a few feet away from the door, just out of arm's reach, and stood there for a moment, like she was trying to decide whether to say something. I asked if she was okay, if she needed help, but she just shook her head and looked around, like she was making sure no one else was watching. Then she looked back at me, and in a quiet voice, she asked if she could ride with me for a while. Now, this wasn't the first time someone had asked me for a ride, but something about this felt different. There was something in her voice, something desperate, that set off alarm bells in my head. I asked her where she was headed, and she just shrugged, saying she didn't care. She just needed to get away from here. That's when I noticed that she kept glancing back at the other truck, like she was afraid someone might come out at any moment. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct was telling me to say no, to roll up the window and drive away, but there was something in her eyes that made me hesitate. She looked scared, really scared, and I couldn't just leave her there if she was in some kind of trouble. I told her to hold on for a second, that I needed to check something, and I rolled up the window. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was going on. I decided to go inside the truck stop and see if anyone knew anything about the woman or the other truck. I told her to wait by my truck and that I'd be right back. She nodded, but she looked even more nervous now, like she didn't want me to leave her alone. I walked back into the truck stop and headed straight for the counter. The guy behind the counter was still there, flipping through a magazine. I asked him if he knew anything about the woman outside or the truck parked next to mine. He looked up at me, then glanced out the window at the two trucks. "Been here for a couple of hours," he said, sounding bored. "She came in earlier, bought some snacks, and left. Didn't say much." I asked if she was with anyone, if she had talked to anyone, but he just shrugged and went back to his magazine. I thanked him and walked back outside, feeling even more uneasy now. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't just leave her there, not if she was in trouble. When I got back to my truck, she was gone. I looked around, trying to spot her, but she was nowhere to be seen. The other truck was still there, the door still slightly open, but there was no sign of her. I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach, wondering if I should go look for her, but at the same time, I didn't want to get involved in something that could turn ugly. I stood there for a few minutes, debating with myself, before finally deciding to just get back on the road. I climbed into my cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot, still feeling uneasy but not sure what else to do. I drove for about an hour, the road empty and dark, before I finally started to relax a bit. I told myself that she had probably just needed a ride, that maybe she had found another trucker to help her, and that everything was fine. But that nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. A few miles down the road, I saw flashing lights up ahead, police lights. As I got closer, I saw that they had pulled over a truck, and my heart skipped a beat when I realized it was the same truck from the rest stop, the one with the open door. I slowed down as I passed, trying to see what was going on. There were two police cars, and the officers were talking to someone, but I couldn't see who it was. I thought about stopping, about telling them what had happened, but I wasn't sure if it was even related. Besides, what could I say? That a woman had asked me for a ride and then disappeared? I kept driving, trying to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was she? Why was she so scared? And what was going on with that other truck? The questions swirled around in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just dodged a bullet, that something really bad could have happened if I had decided to give her a ride. When I finally reached Denver the next day, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I delivered the load, signed the paperwork, and headed to a nearby truck stop to get some rest. But even after a good night's sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about the woman, and about the truck with the open door. I never did find out what happened to her, or why she was so desperate to get away. I kept an eye on the news for a few days, hoping to hear something, but there was nothing. It was like she had just vanished into thin air. Looking back, I still don't know what the right thing to do was. Maybe I should have helped her. Maybe I should have told the cops what I saw. But at the time, I just didn't know what to do. All I know is that I'll never forget the look in her eyes. The fear, the desperation. It's a look that haunts me, even now. These days, I'm a lot more cautious on the road. I don't stop for just anyone, and I'm always aware of my surroundings. Always looking out for anything that seems off. Because you never know who you might run into out there, or what kind of trouble they might bring with them. It's a lonely life, being a trucker, but it's also a dangerous one. And sometimes, it's not the road that's the most dangerous part. It's the people you meet along the way. So let me tell you about this experience I had a few years back, when I was still driving trucks for a living. It's the kind of story that I don't share much, partly because it still creeps me out when I think about it, and partly because it sounds almost too weird to be true. But it happened, and it's stuck with me ever since. I'd been driving long haul for a while, and I was used to the long stretches of highway, the late nights, and the solitude. It's not a job for everyone, but I liked it. There's something about being on the open road, just you and your thoughts, that can be pretty calming. Of course, it can also get pretty lonely, but I didn't mind that so much. I had my routines, my playlists, and the occasional call home to break up the monotony. This particular trip was from Dallas to Los Angeles, a route I'd done a few times before. It's a long drive, but it's straightforward, mostly interstate with plenty of truck stops along the way. I'd left Dallas in the late afternoon, planning to drive through the night and take a break somewhere in New Mexico. The weather was good, the traffic was light, and I was making great time. Everything was going smoothly until I hit West Texas, somewhere around midnight. It's a desolate stretch of road out there, miles and miles of nothing but flat land, with the occasional gas station or small town that feels like it's barely clinging to life. I was in the zone, just cruising along with the radio playing low, when I saw something up ahead that made me slow down. There was a car on the side of the road, hazards flashing. Normally, I wouldn't think much of it. People break down all the time, but this car was parked at an odd angle, almost like it had swerved off the road. I could see the silhouette of someone standing next to it, waving their arms. I was about to pass them by, but something made me ease off the gas. Maybe it was just that instinct to help someone in trouble, or maybe it was curiosity. Either way, I decided to pull over. I stopped a little ahead of the car, turned on my own hazards, and got out. As I walked back towards the car, I could see it was an older model sedan, beat up and rusty. The person who'd been waving was a man, maybe in his late 40s, with a thin build and messy hair. He looked anxious, almost frantic, and as I got closer, I could see why. The front of his car was smashed up pretty bad. The hood was crumpled, the front bumper hanging off, and there was fluid leaking onto the road. I asked him if he was okay, and he nodded, but he was breathing heavily, like he'd just been in a fight or something. He told me he'd hit something, a deer, he thought, but he wasn't sure. He'd been driving when suddenly something darted out in front of him, and he didn't have time to stop. I looked around, expecting to see the animal on the side of the road, but there was nothing there. No blood, no fur, nothing. That struck me as odd, but I didn't say anything. I asked him if he needed a tow, but he shook his head, said he'd already called for one and they were on their way. I offered to stay with him until they arrived, but he quickly said no, that I should keep going. The whole thing felt strange, but I figured he was just shaken up. So I nodded, wished him luck, and headed back to my truck. As I drove away, I kept thinking about the scene. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the fact that he seemed so desperate for me to leave, or the way he kept looking around, like he was expecting someone, or something. But I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the late hour and the isolation. You see strange things when you're tired. A few hours later, I pulled into a truck stop just outside of Albuquerque. I was tired, and I figured it was a good place to catch a few hours of sleep before finishing the drive. The truck stop was one of those big ones, with a diner, showers, and a lot full of rigs parked for the night. I found a spot, parked, and went inside to grab something to eat. The diner was almost empty, just a few other truckers scattered around. I ordered some coffee and a sandwich, trying to shake the weird feeling I'd had since West Texas. As I sat there, I overheard a couple of the other truckers talking. They were going on about a story they'd heard on the CB earlier. A trucker who'd seen something strange on the road, just outside of town. My ears perked up, and I listened more closely. One of the guys was saying he'd heard about a trucker who'd stopped to help someone, only to find out later that the person had vanished without a trace. The story was vague, just bits and pieces, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I finished my meal, trying to push the story out of my mind. After all, truckers are notorious for telling tall tales, especially when they've been on the road too long. But as I walked back out to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and settled in to get some sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing noises, little creaks and groans from the truck, the wind outside, and every now and then, what sounded like footsteps on the gravel. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too many miles and too little rest, but it didn't help. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my door. It wasn't a loud knock, more like a tap, but it jolted me awake. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. The parking lot was dark, the lights from the truck stop casting long shadows across the ground. I couldn't see anyone, but I could still hear that faint tapping, like someone was lightly rapping their knuckles against the door. I hesitated, debating whether to open the door or just ignore it, but the knocking continued, slow and steady, like whoever it was had all the time in the world. Finally, I reached over, grabbed the handle, and cracked the door open. There was no one there. I stuck my head out, looked around, but the lot was empty, just rows of parked trucks, silent and still. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Maybe it was the wind, I thought, or some loose piece of metal rattling against the side of the truck, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I closed the door, locked it again, and sat there for a moment, trying to calm down. That's when I noticed something on the passenger seat. It was just a piece of paper, folded in half. I hadn't seen it there before, and I had no idea how it got there. My hands were shaking as I reached over and picked it up. The paper was dirty, smudged with grease, and the writing on it was messy, like someone had scrawled it in a hurry. All it said was, "It wasn't a deer." My stomach dropped. I stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. What the hell did that mean? Who had left it? And how did they get inside my truck? I looked around the cab, but nothing seemed out of place. The doors were still locked, the windows closed. There was no sign that anyone had been inside. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at that note, trying to figure out what to do. I wanted to leave, to get the hell out of there, and put as much distance between me and that truck stop as possible. But I was too scared to move, too scared to even start the engine. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was up, and the lot was bustling with activity. Trucks pulling out, drivers walking around, the diner filling up with the breakfast crowd. I felt a sense of relief, like the daylight had banished whatever had happened the night before. But that note was still there, crumpled up on the passenger seat, a grim reminder that it hadn't been just a bad dream. I grabbed it, shoved it into my pocket, and decided to get back on the road. I wanted to get to Los Angeles as quickly as possible, to finish the job and get home. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was following me. When I finally got to LA, I delivered the load, signed the paperwork, and headed straight for a motel. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and all I wanted was a hot shower and a good night's sleep. But even as I lay in that cheap motel bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the note, about the man on the side of the road, and about what he had really hit that night in West Texas. To this day, I still don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just some weird prank, or maybe it was something more. But I do know one thing. Ever since that night, I've been a lot more careful on the road. I don't stop for people on the side of the highway anymore, and I always make sure my truck is locked tight when I'm parked, because you never know what or who you might encounter out there, in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes it's better not to find out. Alright, let me tell you about this one night that still gets under my skin whenever I think about it. It happened a few years ago, back when I was driving trucks full time. I've been on the road for years, seen all kinds of things, but this experience, it's different. It's not something I like to talk about much, but since you asked, here it goes. So, it was late fall, and I was on a routine haul from Houston, Texas to Phoenix, Arizona. I'd done this route plenty of times before, knew the roads like the back of my hand. The trip was supposed to be pretty straightforward. Pick up a load of auto parts in Houston, drive through the night, and drop them off in Phoenix the next morning. Easy, right? At least that's what I thought. I set out from Houston around 5 p.m., planning to drive straight through with just a couple of quick stops for fuel and coffee. The weather was decent, clear skies, cool air, not too bad for a night drive. The first few hours were uneventful, just miles of highway rolling under my wheels. I had the radio on low, mostly for some background noise, and I was making good time. It was around 11 p.m. when I hit a stretch of highway in West Texas, the kind of road where there's nothing but darkness on either side, and the only light comes from your own headlights. I was in the zone, just focusing on the road ahead, when I noticed something odd up ahead. At first it looked like a shadow moving across the road, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. Now, you don't see a lot of people walking along the highway in the middle of nowhere, especially not at that time of night. I slowed down, trying to get a better look. It was a woman, from what I could tell, and she was standing on the side of the road, waving her arms. I pulled over, maybe 50 yards ahead of where she was, and put on my hazards. Something didn't feel right, but I figured maybe she needed help. Maybe her car had broken down or something. I got out of the truck and started walking towards her, keeping my eyes on her the whole time. She was wearing a long coat, her hair was messy, and she looked like she'd been through the ringer. As I got closer, I could see she was crying, her face pale in the dim light from my truck's headlights. I asked her if she was okay, if she needed help, and she just nodded, looking over her shoulder nervously, like she was scared of something behind her. I looked around, but all I saw was the empty highway stretching out in both directions. I asked her where her car was, and she pointed down the road, saying it was a little ways back. I offered to give her a ride to the nearest town, or at least to a gas station, and she nodded again, still looking like she was about to break down any second. So, I led her back to my truck, trying to make small talk to calm her down, but she wasn't saying much, just kept looking around like she expected someone to jump out of the dark. We got back to the truck, and I opened the passenger door for her. She hesitated for a second, then climbed in. I got back in the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road. I asked her where she was headed, but she just shook her head, saying she didn't care. She just needed to get away from here. I didn't push it, figured she'd talk when she was ready. We drove in silence for a while. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the tires on the asphalt. I kept glancing over at her, trying to get a read on her, but she was just staring straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. After a few minutes, I tried again, asked her what had happened, why she was out there alone in the middle of the night. That's when she finally spoke. She told me she'd been traveling with her boyfriend, heading west, but they'd gotten into a fight and he'd left her on the side of the road, just dumped her there and drove off. She didn't have a phone, didn't know where she was, and had been walking for hours, hoping someone would stop and help her. The way she talked about him, though, it wasn't just a regular fight. There was something in her voice, a kind of fear that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told her not to worry, that I'd get her to the next town and we could figure out what to do from there. But she kept saying she didn't want to go to the police, didn't want to make a big deal out of it. She just wanted to get as far away from him as possible. We drove for another half hour or so, and I could see she was starting to calm down a bit. I kept the conversation light, asking about where she was from, what she did for a living, stuff like that. She started to open up a little, but there was still this tension in the air, like she was waiting for something bad to happen. We were about 10 miles outside of Fort Stockton when she suddenly stiffened up, her eyes wide with fear. She was staring out the side mirror, and when I looked, I saw what had her so scared. Headlights, coming up fast behind us. I told her it was probably just another trucker, but she shook her head, saying it was him, her boyfriend. He'd found her. I looked in the mirror again, and sure enough, the car was getting closer, its headlights glaring in the darkness. I tried to stay calm, told her we'd lose him, but she was panicking, saying he'd never let her go. I pushed the pedal to the floor, trying to put some distance between us and the car behind, but it was gaining on us. I could feel the tension in the cab, her fear infecting me, making my heart race. The car was almost on us now, its lights blinding in the mirrors. Then, just as it seemed like it was going to ram us, it swerved into the other lane and pulled up alongside. For a second, I thought maybe he was just trying to scare us, but then I saw him, the driver. He was leaning out the window, glaring at us with this look of pure rage. He had wild, bloodshot eyes, his face twisted with anger. He started shouting, but I couldn't make out the words over the roar of the engines. Then, out of nowhere, he jerked the wheel, slamming his car into the side of my truck. The whole rig shuddered, and I had to fight to keep control. He hit us again, harder this time, and I could hear the metal screeching as his car scraped along the side of the trailer. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to keep the truck on the road, but he was relentless, ramming us over and over. The woman was screaming now, begging him to stop, but he didn't seem to hear her. He was like a man possessed. His only focus was running us off the road. I spotted an exit up ahead, and I made a split-second decision. I yanked the wheel to the right, taking the off-ramp at the last second. The car tried to follow, but he was going too fast and overshot it, skidding off the road and into the dirt. I floored it, barreling down the ramp and onto a smaller road, praying he wouldn't catch up. We drove like that for miles, me glancing in the mirror every few seconds, expecting to see those headlights again. but they never came. Eventually, I started to relax, my hands shaking from the adrenaline. The woman was sobbing quietly, her face buried in her hands. I kept driving until we reached Fort Stockton, and I pulled into a gas station, my heart still pounding. I told her to wait in the truck while I went inside to get us something to drink. I needed a minute to calm down, to think. When I came back out, she was gone. I searched the lot, the surrounding area, but there was no sign of her. It was like she'd just vanished. I even went inside and asked the clerk if he'd seen her, but he just shook his head. I was baffled, didn't know what to make of it. Part of me was relieved. Maybe she'd found someone else to help her. Maybe she'd decided to keep running on her own. But there was another part of me, a darker part that couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got back in the truck, sat there for a while, just staring at the empty passenger seat. I couldn't get her out of my head, couldn't stop wondering what had happened to her. I drove the rest of the way to Phoenix in a daze, my mind replaying everything that had happened, trying to make sense of it. When I got to Phoenix, I delivered the load, signed the paperwork, and called it a day. But I couldn't let it go. I kept thinking about that night, about the look in her eyes when she saw those headlights, the way she just disappeared without a trace. A few weeks later, I was back on the same route, driving through West Texas again. I couldn't help but keep an eye out for her, or for that car, but there was nothing, just empty road and the occasional distant headlights. It wasn't until months later that I heard something that made my blood run cold. I was talking to another trucker at a rest stop, and he mentioned a story he'd heard on the CB, a woman who'd been found dead on the side of the highway, not far from where I'd picked her up. The details were vague, but it sounded like she'd been running from someone, maybe an abusive boyfriend. The worst part, they never found the guy who did it. I don't know if it was her. I don't know if she's still out there somewhere, trying to escape, or if she met a worse fate after I lost her. But I do know one thing. Since that night, I've been a lot more cautious about who I stop for on the side of the road, because sometimes, even when you try to help, you end up getting pulled into something far darker than you ever expected. And sometimes the scariest thing on the road isn't the miles ahead, but the people you meet along the way.